Before Jesus began his work in the cities, he walked away from everything and headed deep into the silent wilderness. For 40 days and nights he had no audience to applaud him, no comfortable bed to sleep in, and no food to satisfy his hunger. He stripped away the noise of the world until there was nothing left but the wind, the sand, and his own breath. In that total emptiness, the distractions that define most people's lives, status, physical comfort, and the approval of others simply vanished. When you are starving in a desert, you stop caring about your reputation or your collection of fine clothes. You realize very quickly that your survival actually requires very little, and that most of what you carry is just heavy baggage. In the silence, Jesus faced the strongest temptations to use his power for his own ego, but he refused every single one. He proved that a person is most powerful not when they have everything, but when they need nothing from the world to be whole. This was the art of emptying, a deliberate choice to clear out the inner clutter so that the truth could finally speak. Most of us spend our lives trying to fill our schedules and our houses, fearing the quiet because it forces us to look at ourselves. But the wilderness shows us that until you are comfortable with nothing, you will always be a slave to the more that the world promises. True strength is found in that 0 point, where you no longer rely on external props to tell you who you are. When you walk out of your own wilderness, you carry a clarity that no amount of money or fame can ever buy. You become real because you have met yourself in the dark and realized that the light was already inside you. There was once a famous sculptor who stood before a massive, jagged block of cold white marble. Day after day he struck the stone with his chisel, sending sharp flakes of rock flying across his dusty workshop. A young apprentice watched him work for months, confused by why the master seemed to be destroying so much of the expensive stone. Eventually, a magnificent, powerful lion began to emerge from the heart of the marble, looking as if it might breathe at any second. The apprentice asked in wonder, "Master, how did you know how to create such a perfect and noble creature from a plain rock?" The old sculptor wiped the white dust from his face and gave a very direct and simple answer. "I did not create the lion," he said. "I simply looked at the stone and removed everything that did not look like a lion." This is the sculptor's secret. The realization that your best self is not something you build, but something you uncover. We are born as solid blocks of truth, but as we grow, we pile on layers of fake personalities, social masks, and hollow desires. We spend years trying to sculpt a version of ourselves that will impress the neighbors or please a boss. But the real work of a meaningful life is a process of subtraction, not addition. It is about chipping away the lies, the pretenses, and the extra baggage that we picked up along the way to survive. When you stop trying to be someone, the real you finally has enough space to breathe and stand tall. The beauty of the lion was always there, waiting inside the stone, just as your integrity is always there under the noise. In a crowded and noisy marketplace, 100 merchants were shouting at the top of their lungs to sell their goods. Everyone was making grand promises, claiming their fruit was the sweetest and their silk was the strongest in the land. In the middle of this chaos sat an old man with a small wooden table, selling simple handmade tools for daily labor. He did not shout, he did not wave his arms, and he did not try to argue with the people walking past. He simply sat in a state of deep, steady silence, watching the world with eyes that seemed to see right through the noise. Curiously, as the day went on, the shouting merchants began to lose their voices, and the crowd grew tired of their empty words. One by one, people began to gather around the silent man's table, drawn by a gravity they couldn't quite explain. Because he said so little, every word he eventually spoke carried the weight of pure gold. When he told a customer that a tool would last a lifetime, they believed him instantly, because a man who doesn't waste words doesn't waste truth. We live in an age where everyone feels the pressure to express an opinion and broadcast their life every single minute. We think that the more we talk, the more influence we have, but the opposite is often the direct and real truth. The more you talk, the more you dilute your power. The more you explain, the more you reveal your own insecurity. Silence is a filter that separates the real from the fake, showing that you are solid enough to stand without an audience. Gold is never found floating on the surface of a loud, rushing river. It is found deep in the quiet, heavy earth. Two men set out at dawn to cross a steep mountain range before the winter storms arrived. The first traveler was a wealthy merchant who carried a massive leather-bound pack stuffed with heavy bars of gold and fine silk robes. He believed that his riches would buy him respect and safety at the villages on the other side of the peak. The second traveler was a simple worker who carried only a light cloth bag containing dried bread, a water skin, and a sturdy walking stick. As the trail grew narrow and the air became thin, the merchant began to stumble and gasp for breath under the crushing weight of his gold. He was so obsessed with looking successful and protecting his status that he refused to leave a single coin behind. Meanwhile, the worker moved with a steady, rhythmic pace, his eyes focused on the path and his body feeling light and free. By mid-afternoon, the merchant was crawling on his hands and knees, his face turned red and his heart pounding like a drum. He looked up at the worker and shouted in anger, "How can you be so fast while I am dying under the weight of my future?" The worker stopped and looked back with a direct, honest gaze that cut through the merchant's pride. "I am not carrying a future," the worker said. "I am just carrying what I need for today. You are trying to carry a kingdom up a cliff. Most of us spend our lives packing our bags with the heavy stones of face, titles, and past failures. We think these things define us, but on the real mountain of life they are just the baggage that causes us to fall. The moment you decide to drop the heavy pack of other people's expectations, you find that the climb becomes a joy rather than a struggle. You don't need a golden crown to reach the summit, you just need to be light enough to keep moving." In a lush, green orchard, a master gardener stood before a pear tree that was overflowing with hundreds of wild, leafy branches. He took a sharp pair of shears and began to cut away large, healthy-looking limbs, letting them fall uselessly to the muddy ground. A passerby stopped and gasped in horror, asking why the gardener was destroying such a beautiful and thriving tree. "Look at all those leaves you are wasting," the stranger said. "That tree could have been twice as large if you just let it grow." The gardener didn't look up from his work, his movements precise and real as he continued to thin out the center of the tree. "If I let every branch grow just because it looks green," he explained, "the tree will spend all its energy on leaves and never have enough strength for fruit. By the time summer comes, the branches will be so heavy they will snap, and the pears will be small, sour, and useless. This is the law of the pruning shears, the understanding that more is often the enemy of better. In our own lives, we often try to say yes to every opportunity, every social invitation, and every new hobby that catches our eye. We grow 100 branches in a dozen different directions, feeling busy and thriving because we are constantly moving. But without the courage to cut back, our energy is spread so thin that we never produce anything truly sweet or lasting. The most difficult part of growth is the direct and honest act of giving up something good to make room for something great. You have to decide which one or two things actually matter and let the rest of the distractions fall to the ground. A tree that isn't pruned becomes a tangled mess. A life that isn't pruned becomes an exhausted blur of wasted potential. Real success is the fruit that grows in the sun after the extra leaves have been cleared away. In a kingdom obsessed with appearances, there was a young ruler who wore the most magnificent robes ever woven. His garments were heavy with gold thread, encrusted with rare jewels, and draped in layers of thick, crimson velvet. Every time he walked through the palace, he moved slowly and stiffly, his shoulders aching under the massive weight of his own status. The people cheered for the glory of his clothes, but in the private corners of the garden, the king could barely breathe. He realized that his life had become a series of performances, hidden behind a fancy wall of decoration and expensive fabric. One evening, he finally grew tired of the sweat and the strain. He tore off the heavy robes and threw the jeweled crown into a corner. He found a simple, worn tunic made of rough gray linen, the kind of clothes a gardener or a woodcutter might wear. When he slipped it on, he felt a sudden, electric shock of freedom as his lungs finally expanded to their full capacity. He walked out into the cool night air and realized that for the first time in years, he could actually feel the wind against his skin. We live in a modern age of over-packaging, where every idea is wrapped in professional jargon, and every person is hidden behind a digital filter. We think that the truth needs to be complicated, shiny, and dressed up in a three-piece suit to be taken seriously. But the most real and direct power in the world is found in the skeleton of truth, the bare, honest facts that don't need a costume. A simple "I am sorry" is more powerful than a 10-page legal apology. A direct "I love you" is better than a diamond ring bought for show. When you peel back the fancy lies that you tell yourself and others, you find that the truth is light, steady, and incredibly sturdy. You don't need a crown to be a leader, and you don't need a stage to be heard. You just need to be honest enough to stand in your own skin. The more you simplify your message in your life, the more space you have for the things that actually have a heartbeat. At the end of a long and dusty road, an old traveler sat by a small campfire and looked at his weathered, empty hands. He had spent decades chasing more, more property, more followers, more experiences, and more complicated answers to life's big questions. But as the stars came out, he realized that the happiest moments of his journey were the ones where he had the least to worry about. The return to zero is not about being poor or being lazy. It is about finding the sweet spot where you are no longer distracted by the noise. Most of us are running a race toward a finish line that doesn't exist, piling up likes and tasks until we can't see the sky anymore. The direct and real path to a peaceful life is to stop pursuing more and start pursuing accuracy. It means looking at your social circle and asking who actually makes me a better person, and letting the rest of the noise fade away. It means looking at your work list and asking, what is the one thing that actually provides value? And doing that one thing with total focus. Clean out your house, clean out your schedule, and most importantly, clean out the mental clutter of comparing yourself to strangers on a screen. When you return to the 0 point, you realize that your true needs are incredibly simple: a purpose, a few real friends, and the courage to be yourself. Don't be afraid of a quiet house or an empty weekend. That space is where your soul finally has a chance to catch its breath. A real person is someone who lives with a bare-bones honesty, refusing to be a billboard for a life they aren't actually enjoying. From this day forward, try to be clean in your actions and simple in your words, without the need to prove anything to anyone. The less you have to hide, the more energy you have to build a life that is solid, stable, and truly yours. In the end, we don't remember the people who had the most. We remember the people who were the most real while they were here. The 0 point is not the end of the story. It is the clean slate where the best part of your life finally begins.